those. Today we continue, if you're a guest with us today, we're glad that you're here. We're continuing a little mini-series we started really talking about our mission and our vision for our church. We started about 4 weeks ago and really talking about who we are as First Baptist Landrum. That we are called as a church. We believe we're here to know Christ and to build community. And those are built on 4 pillars, or 4 understandings, 4 character traits. And that's to love, to learn, to live, and to lead. I talked about love on week 1 after the initial talk about our whole mission. And then last week, Glenn preached on learning and discipleship. And today, Graham comes and really fits right in with what they did last weekend and is going to talk to you and preach about living for Christ. So I pray you'll listen, and I thank God for what Graham has to say to us this morning, and we're glad that you're here to hear it.
I didn't know, I don't know because I'm loud enough that I don't need a mic, but we know that the people online need to hear me. I turned it on. I didn't turn the mute off, though. You got to cut the mute off. Like I said, I'm loud enough, so I don't really need a microphone for the church to hear me. But I do know Micah has his earplugs in because of how loud I am, and Jamie has let me know that. So, yes, as we're going to continue this, I want to say it's like a vision casting to the church, because our main focus as we move forward into what the life of First Baptist Landrum is. It's these 2 things. We want to know Christ and build community. And the first couple of weeks, Pastor Mark preached on that of what knowing Christ and building community actually looks like. And then we've been diving into the building blocks of it. And the first one was love. We got to love God first and foremost. And out of that love for Him comes our love for those around us. And then last week, Pastor Glenn came and he spoke and preached to you guys about what learning looks like. About that we got to learn more about Christ if we're going to love Him. We got to learn about Christ if we're going to live like Him. That we got to be in discipleship, that all these things have to happen for us to know Christ and build community. And so today, like the last 2 weeks, we've been focusing on knowing Christ. And today we're taking a step into what building community looks like. How we can build the community of this church, how we can build personal community with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit inside of us. And how all these things work together for us to live like Christ. Because if we want the people to know Christ in this world, if we want this church communities to be built up from the ground up, we've got to live like Christ. And so that's what we're focusing on today. If you want to turn to Philippians chapter 1, we're going to be starting in verse 21 this morning. But before we read, I want us to hit something real fast from the first 2 weeks that stood out to me from me and Pastor Mark and Pastor Glenn as we talk through these sermons each week. When it comes to loving God, when it comes to loving Him first and foremost, we love Him because He's our Lord. We love Him because He's our Savior. We love Him because He's our friend. He's our perfect sacrifice. He's our propitiation. He's our substitute. He is our God. And the reason why we need to love Him and learn more about Him and know who He is because when we truly know who Christ is, it changes our life. And the knowing Christ begins with our love for God. He controls, as Pastor Mark said, our thoughts. He controls our every word. And He controls our every action. And then out of that, then last week we started talking about what learning Christ looks like. And I think a big word that we talked about in staff meeting was this word discipleship. That there's 2 aspects. You've got personal discipleship, you getting in the Word, you being present in worship, you sharing in your burdens with your family or your small group or your community group or your connect groups here at the church. But then there's also outward discipleship of how you're pouring into those around you. And how you're allowing someone who's further along in their walk with Christ to pour into you. And so out of that, now we come to this week of living like Christ. And so we're going to look at this. Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 21, it says this. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And I do not know which to choose. But if I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. Only, and here's the big one, only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you, and you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Lord, I pray for this morning, Lord, I pray that the words that come out my mouth, Lord, they're from you and you alone, and that, Lord, we can leave this place changed, that we can leave this place living for you. In His name we pray, amen. Now, if you look at your watches, it's 11:35. I can promise you we will not be out by 11:45. So if that's your plan to get to lunch, you might want to just head out those doors right now, because we will be here for a good solid 25 minutes. Okay, so just in your minds, prepare. We're getting out after 11:45. All right, are we cool? Cool beans. All right, so question. After I read this letter, and Paul's talking about, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. The question that comes to my mind is, what is the purpose of life? See, if we're gonna live like Christ, we got to understand His purpose for our life. And so when I read this, Paul says in 21, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. To Paul, Christ was his life. Christ was Paul's life. I think that's where it starts, with our living like Christ. He has to be our life. Not what's in this world, not everything else around us that's happening, but Christ has to be our life. He has to be our foundation. He has to be our center. He has to be our purpose, our direction, our power. He has to give us meaning. Christ has to be our life. He is our example. And for the entirety of life here on earth, in every second that Jesus spent on this earth, He spent it with three different people groups. And so when I look at this, and I know that the purpose of this morning's message is for us to look at what it looks like to live like Christ. We're going to look at Christ because He is our example. And to Paul, Christ was life. And so Jesus, here on earth, spent His time with three people. Number one, if you're taking notes, the first person that Jesus spent time with was the Father. And I know Jesus was God. So like He had God's thoughts and God's motives and God's actions and everything about God inside of Him living here on earth. But He still had to spend time alone with the Father. And that was probably the most important thing that Jesus did with His life. Many different times, whether it was before something major that was going to happen or after something major that had just happened, Jesus made time to spend alone with God. I said it in the first service, and I'm gonna go with the more simpler term in this second one. And it's this: if you want to pour your cup out, it must be filled first. If you want to pour your cup out, it must be filled first. And so when we look at the example of Jesus, I think we can all agree that Jesus, for the most of His life, did nothing but pour His cup out. He poured it out to the disciples. He poured it out to the lost. He poured it out to so many different people by healing, by teaching. Man, all Jesus did for a lot of His time was just pour, 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 pour. But the moments that meant the most to Him was the moments when He was alone with the Father. And so before I say anything else this morning, we need to understand that God desires to be alone with you. Not all the time, but at very important times, God desires to be alone with you. He created you. He knit you together. He knows every detail about you. You, if you want to write this down, you are worth it. God desires to be alone with you. In Luke 4, Jesus prays in the wilderness for 40 days. We know that he's tempted and all these things happen. But before Jesus ever does his ministry here on earth, he spends 40 days in the wilderness with the Father. He's getting his cup filled up. He's getting poured into. After a long, hard day of work, out doing ministry and teaching, Jesus in Mark chapter 6 recharges himself. In Matthew 14, after John the Baptist dies, his best friend in the entire world, he has to work through this grief, and so he spends time alone with the Father. Luke chapter 6, before making an important decision, Jesus spends time with the Father. In Luke chapter 22, before Jesus is put on trial and he's crucified in the garden, he spends time with the Father. And so every time that, because I think we can all agree that on the cross, that was Jesus' biggest moment of pouring his life out for us. And so as Jesus goes to pour it out, it must be poured in. And the biggest way that Jesus did this was through prayer. And quite simply for us as human beings, prayer is the best form of communication with our Father. Christ was God. We can all agree. But he was also human. And so the things that you go through, the heartaches, the stress, the busyness, everything that you go through, he also went through because he was human. And so if Jesus is going to spend this time alone with the Father, so will I. And the biggest way for us to do it is through prayer. And if the word prayer just isn't important enough, it's mentioned over 250 times in the Bible. About us going before the Father, about us being alone with him, about us praying to him, about us taking things to him. Prayer is important because it gives us an opportunity to share all aspects of our life with the Father. He knows about them. He does. He knows what you're going through. But he wants you to bring them to him. He wants to be personal with them. It gives us a chance to express our gratitude. I think we can all agree that God blesses us, that God gives us gifts, that he does things for his children. He loves us. But parents, when you give your kids a gift, don't you want to thank you? Same for the Father. When he blesses you, when he gives you something that you probably didn't deserve, he wants to thank you. And so prayer is a great way for you to show your gratitude towards him. It's a platform for confessing our sins. We mess up. Continue to mess up. We will. But we need to take them to him. Prayer is an act of worship and obedience. I think Jesus, with his entire life, he lived this life of worship. And being in prayer with the Father in those important times was a great way that he worshiped his Father. Because Jesus didn't come to be worshiped. He came to show the world his Father, so that the world would worship him. And so that comes to our last aspect of Jesus spending time with the Father is this worship. Jesus lived a life of worship. If you want to write a passage down under that, Romans 12:1, from the words of Paul. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercies, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to the Lord. This is your spiritual act of worship. When I look at the life of Jesus, but my man never had a home, never had a bed to sleep in, didn't really have shoes to walk in. And he let the disciples know this. Hey, when you follow me, it's going to be tough. And so Jesus lived a life of sacrifice, which means he lived a life of worship. And so Jesus, number one, spent time with the Father. I think before anything else, before we can go into anything else this morning, you need to understand the importance of spending that Christ in this world. Your cup's got to be filled up. And that only comes by you spending alone time with the Father. Number two, let's move on. Second people group that Jesus spent time with was his church. Jesus spent time with the church. Now, I don't mean all the different crowds that followed him, because Jesus had a lot of fans. He didn't have a lot of followers. He had 12. And so when I'm talking about the church, we are talking about his 12 disciples, not the thousands that followed him. Not the hundreds that want him to heal them. Not the 5,000 that he fed or everybody that followed him when he healed, but we're talking about the 12. That was Jesus' church, was the 12 disciples. And so Jesus spent time, and I think we can all agree because of every Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus is with the disciples. And so, Jesus, number one, he taught his church. He taught his church. Jesus spent many hours teaching in parables. And basically at the end of most of them, he said, whoever has ears, let them hear. Most of the people didn't, because they were his fans, not his followers. And so the real true followers, when Jesus taught, stayed back and asked, what did that mean? And Jesus, like a father to his son, would sit him down and explain everything that he was saying. Because he taught his church. In Mark 4:34, Jesus finished teaching the crowds, and his disciples were confused. So they asked him, Jesus, what'd that mean? Rabbi, what'd that mean? And Jesus would go on and explain it to them. Jesus taught his church. And here's why. Because not with the thousands in the crowd, not with the thousands of his fans, but with these 12 boys, Jesus planned to change the world. And so if with the 12, Jesus planned to change the world, what would Jesus do if you taught this church? If you taught a small group, if you taught a Sunday school class, if you brought together some men, if you brought together some women and just created a small group and just opened up the Word and looked at it together, what could Jesus change about this church? And so Jesus taught his church. Number two, Jesus served his church. Jesus served these 12 disciples. Outside of dying on the cross for their sins, the second greatest example of him serving them was the night of the Passover when Jesus washed their feet. And he did it for a couple of reasons. Number one was to teach a couple of disciples a lesson, because they were arguing about who's going to be the greatest amongst the people in heaven. And Jesus, their Savior and their Lord and their Rabbi, got down on his hands and knees and washed their feet. He was trying to teach them a lesson, but also he was teaching them about humility. These 12 knew who Jesus was. They knew, and they had seen the healings. They followed him practically everywhere. He had taught them all this amazing wisdom and understanding and all these different things. But Jesus at this moment was teaching them humility. He served his church. And then lastly, he gave to his church. Number one, his life. Jesus gave his life on the cross. He gave everything to his church. He taught the disciples about giving. He taught the Pharisees about giving. In Matthew 23 and Luke 11, the Pharisees, Jesus and his disciples are walking, and they pass by a synagogue, and they see some Pharisees outside bragging about how much they had just given to the church. And Jesus in that moment looks to the Pharisees and humbles them. Lets them know, hey man, it's not about how much you gave. Okay, giving's right, but it's not about how much you gave. He was trying to teach them humility in their giving. And then in Mark 12, Jesus teaches his disciples. There's a woman, I think most of us have heard this. There's a woman, and she's very poor, and she's walking up to give her money to the synagogue, and she puts in 2 little coins. After priests and Pharisees and Sadducees and rich people and everybody have come in and just dumped bags and bags and bags in I don't know if you want to call them buckets or whatever, but they gave their money. And I can just, if I'm Jesus, I can sit there and I can hear the disciples behind him snickering and laughing. Do you see how much she just gave? Do you see what she doesn't have? And Jesus immediately turns to them and says, hey, it's not about what you give. It's about how you give. The woman gave sacrificially. And so Jesus gave to his church. God sees what man overlooks. God sees what man overlooks. God's evaluation is different from man's. And God commends giving in faith. And so when it comes to the church, I want us to ask ourselves, between teaching and serving and giving, is there a place where God has blessed you that you haven't provided these things for his church yet? There's people in this room that I know of that have a gift for teaching that maybe you're not teaching where you need to. Maybe you're not with the students. Maybe you're not with the kids, but you need to be. Maybe there's areas where you've got wisdom and you're just hoarding it up because, students are scary. I'll agree, especially smelly 7th grade boys. They're scary. Kids, when they run in circles, scary. I'll agree. But maybe you have been given a gift by the Father to raise the next generation. What about serving? Maybe you can't, maybe teaching's not your thing, but serving, getting down and dirty is. Is there an area in this church where you could be serving? Where you could be out front greeting people, where you could be handing out bulletins, where you could be helping Wes in the kitchen on Wednesday nights? If maybe it's coming to the Thanksgiving feast and giving up an hour of preparing plates. Maybe there's an area in this church where you could serve. Maybe it's not teaching, but you can give up your time. You can give up some of your time to help serve. And then lastly, Jesus gave to his church. I think, and I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about your children. I'm talking about your time. I'm talking about your talents. Jesus wasn't always talking about money every time he talked about giving. He wanted the people's hearts. He wanted their hearts. And so I think for a lot of us maybe in this room, you've been holding on to that child, or you've been holding on to your job, or you've been holding on to that sport, or you've been holding on to whatever it is, and you're just choking the life out of God's church because you're holding on to something so tight. When you let things loose, you let it breathe. And so maybe God is asking you just to let go and just to unclench your hands from what he's given you and to give it back to his church. And so Jesus spent time with the Father. He spent time with the church. I was getting ahead of myself. Thirdly, Jesus spent time with the lost. And this was a big part of what we talked about at our fall retreat last weekend. And I asked Pastor Mark if I could preach this Sunday because I knew that what we were going to talk about last weekend while we were at fall retreat was going to relay over into this morning's message. Because I think that the biggest thing that we can do to the lost is to serve them, which is on the back of every student's shirt and my shirt in this room and the one that I gave Pastor Mark that he didn't wear this morning. But the biggest thing that we can do for the lost is to serve them. Luke 19:10 says, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus understood the lost needed forgiveness. Jesus understood the lost needed repentance. I think we often forget that we once were lost too. And that someone served us and brought us the word and brought us the gospel. I'm going to flip over to Mark chapter 2 real quickly. Mark chapter 2 starting in verse 14. And this is pretty close to where we're going to finish this morning. I'm going to read it. Mark chapter 2 verses 14 to 17 says this. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth. And he said to them, follow me. And he got up and followed him. Jesus took a sinner and he became his follower. 15. And it happened that he was reclining at the table. So we're a couple hours after this, and Jesus is at the house of this, my Bible says Levi, but it's Matthew. And he's reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, and they were following him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they said this to his disciples, "Why is he eating and drinking with the tax collectors and sinners?" And hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not to those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but to call the sinners." Now, is there anybody in this room that loves to give taxes? No? Okay, I just became an adult. I hate it myself. All right? But here's the difference. Matthew is a tax collector. And it's not just like you went to JR's office and he worked up some numbers for you and figured out some things. They came to you personally and asked for money. And what they asked, you couldn't say no. And so as Matthew was going and as he was collecting taxes, man, I bet he upcharged everybody. Because he wanted a little extra money for himself. And so Jesus goes to a thief and a robber and calls him to be his disciple. And Matthew follows him. Jesus went to the lost. Jesus made it a point to teach the lost about salvation. Jesus made it a point to serve them all the time. He fed the 5,000. He healed the leper. He healed the unclean woman. He talked to the woman at the well. He healed the blind man. He healed the paralytic. He did all these things, but his number one concern was not their physical abilities. It was their heart. Because after every time Jesus healed somebody and they came to him in faith, he said, "You've been cleansed. You've been healed." Not their physical abilities, their heart. Jesus gave to the lost. He gave his life. He gave his life for the lost. And I think if you want to take any note under Jesus spent time with the lost, this is what you need to write down. Jesus saw them. Jesus saw them. Do you see the lost around you? Do you see their brokenness? Do you see their hurting? Do you see their need? Jesus saw the lost and they became his followers. What if you just talked to one person? How could they change the world? How could they change the world? We're going to end right here. If you want to flip back over to Philippians chapter 2. Well, we were in 1. Now we're going to 2. Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says this. And at the title, I've got a header. I've got a header right above it, and it says, "Be like Christ." And so if we're going to live like Christ, let's look at what being like Christ looks like. Therefore, if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete. And this is what me, Pastor Mark, and Pastor Glenn are doing by bringing you this vision that we have. By being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, being united in spirit and intent on one purpose. Do nothing from selfish or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. As followers of Jesus, we are to serve his church. We are to serve the lost. And before we do any of that, we got to get our cups filled. We have to spend time alone with the Father. And as Philippians chapter 2 states, it starts with sacrifice. It starts with sacrifice. I think there's things all in this room this morning that we can give up. Time, fun things, so that we can accurately serve this church and we can accurately serve the lost. Christ didn't come to be served, but to serve the world around him. And so as we close this morning, I want us to ask ourselves a couple questions. Really, it's 6, so not a couple. First question, have I been lazy? Have I been lazy? I've got the talents. I've got the time. Man, God has given me a gift to teach, or he's given me a gift to serve, but I've just been sitting back. Have I been lazy? Have I been disobedient? I know God's been calling me to do this for a long time now, but I've just been saying no because middle school boys, they scare me. Or kids, they scare me. Or adults like me, they scare me. Maybe you've been disobedient. Have I been living up to God's standard for my life? Have I been living life of sacrifice? Or has my whole world been about me? I think that's where it changes when it comes to living like Christ. Christ was God. Christ had it all. But he came and lived a sacrificial life. His life was not about him. And so, lastly, how can you teach? How can you give? And how can you serve to this world?